So I do not think this is a good idea. Recently, the government announced their new plan that they say will help Canadians with one of the biggest issues that they face. Now, the plan hopes to use banks and financial technology companies to track more information about Canadians, but I don't think it's going to be as helpful as they seem to. In fact, I think it could actually end up hurting the Canadians it's supposed to help. You see, on April 16th, the federal government will be coming out with their yearly budget. This is one of the most important days in Canadian politics because the government tells us, okay, here's where we're going to spend our money, and here's all the things that we're going to change in the country. And it's one of the largest ways that a government can say, hey, you should elect us next time we have an election because of all these great things that we're going to do. Now, this budget is coming up on April 16th, and things aren't looking so good for the current government, especially, and to note this for this video, amongst young Canadians, with only 21% of 18 to 29-year-olds saying that they'll vote Liberal, and only 21% of 30 to 44-year-olds, with the by far favorite being the Conservative Party right now. Now, in the past, it's been these young voters that have largely helped the Liberal government get into power and stay in power for the past 8+ years. But what is the reason that they've now turned their backs on the Liberals? Well, these are the biggest issues in the eyes of these different age groups in Canada. The rising cost of living and housing affordability taking the top slot, especially amongst Gen Z and millennials, these younger voters. So with the budget coming up, the Liberals need to make a big splash, specifically targeting Gen Z and millennials, particularly on the issue of housing affordability. And this is where this tracking situation comes into play. Now, they've already made some changes to housing policy with their Housing Accelerator Fund and the removal of tax on the construction of purpose-built rental buildings, but all of these sort of policies come across as pretty abstract to the average Canadian, or at least it seems that's what the government thinks. But this new tracking system, well, that comes into play here, and it's easy to understand. It's designed to help Canadians buy a home, but there are some major problems with it. And to be honest, it's really making me quite frustrated. But before I get into it, a quick word from this video sponsor. I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, and that's Private Internet Access. Now, Private Internet Access is a VPN, or a virtual private network, that allows you to hide your IP address and encrypt your internet connection. Private Internet Access is the VPN that I personally use, and I do for a bunch of different reasons. Now, I'm no expert when it comes to internet network security, but I don't do anything sketchy or anything that I wouldn't want other people seeing even. But I do recognize that, hey, with enough little pieces of data about a person, you can sketch together a pretty accurate picture of who they are, and that's not something that I would want any bad actors having access to. All of this is on top of some of the more common, more well-known benefits of a VPN, like giving you access to more content on different streaming platforms like Netflix by making them think that you're in a different country than you actually are, giving you access to the catalog of content from that specific country. And these days, a bunch of Canadians are turning to VPNs like Private Internet Access because they're becoming less trusting of their government, largely in connection with some of the more problematic bills, in my opinion, Bill C-11 and Bill C-18, that stops you from accessing certain content on certain social media platforms. Now, Private Internet Access has been downloaded over 30 million times and has an independently audited no logs policy. That just makes sure that none of your personal data is stored by Private Internet Access. And they've also given me a special link that you can use to get 83% off of their normal pricing, bringing it to just over $2 a month, with 4 bonus months for free. And all of this has a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you don't like it or don't end up using it, you don't have to continue to. So again, thank you to Private Internet Access for sponsoring today's video, and make sure to use the link in the description to check out Private Internet Access today. Now, let me show you a clip explaining exactly how the government is framing this new tracking idea.
Renters matter, and young Canadians put a lot of their hard-earned money towards rent. We think that should count for a lot more. As part of our upcoming budget, we're going to create a Canadian Renters Bill of Rights. Give renters a clear history of apartment pricing so they can bargain fairly. We're also going to launch a new legal aid fund. And finally, we're going to help you make your rent count towards you becoming a homeowner. That payment and that demonstrated reliability that you've shown over months and years is taken into account when you apply for a mortgage. We're going to amend the Canadian Mortgage Charter and call on landlords, banks, credit bureaus and others to make sure that your rental history is taken into account in your credit score.
Now, in this clip, he talks about essentially three things, each of which is designed, I believe, to appeal to voters who the Liberals think don't really understand the way the system works, and will likely hear this and not recognize that there are some huge flaws that many critics are voicing. He talks about protections for renters, a renter's bill of rights, sure, a renter protection fund, $15 million going to tenants' right advocacy groups, all in this sort of speech. But the third and most impactful thing, and the item that Trudeau himself seems to be overly excited about, is having your landlord track your rent payments and making those rent payments count towards your credit score to then help you qualify for a mortgage, or at least that's how he explains it. Now, there are some problems with the first 2 points, but I really think I need to emphasize how little sense the third point makes. Now, on its surface, seems like a pretty good idea, right? Every month there are millions of Canadians who are paying rent, and the history of them doing so, making those rent payments on time, that's not tracked. While at the very same time, people who have mortgages and make mortgage payments each month, well, that payment history is tracked and counts towards your credit score. It seems like it's only fair, right? I mean, every Canadian should get an equal shot, and in this situation, renters are being treated differently than homeowners. This theme of fairness, though, I think is something that we're going to be hearing a lot about, as it seems it's sort of becoming the new official slogan of the government leading up to the budget and leading up to the next election, so expect to hear a lot more about making things fair in Canada again. But while this new rent tracking policy might seem to make sense at the surface, when you peel back even just one layer of the situation, at least I think that you quickly realize how little of a difference this makes, and the potential for it to do the exact opposite of what they say it's going to do. Now, let me explain a simple concept here called GDS and TDS. It sounds complex, but as soon as you understand this, everything else is going to make a hell of a lot more sense, and it's really quite simple. The primary reason many Canadians can't qualify for a home has to do with the affordability of homes. And when I say affordability, I'm not just talking about how high or low a house price is. What I really mean here is how high or low a house price is in relation to the potential home buyer's income and the potential cost of getting a mortgage on that home. When you go out to try to qualify for a mortgage, the number one thing that they're looking at is if you can hit something called the GDS, or the gross debt service ratio. This is essentially a measure of what your housing cost will be if they give you this mortgage versus what your income currently is. I've used round numbers here just to make the math super simple, but let's say that your mortgage payment would be $400 and per month, and you make $1,000 a month, right? That would give you a 40% GDS, right? Because your $400 rent payment is 40% of your gross income monthly, right? Your $1,000 income. Now, in order to qualify for a mortgage, that GDS, this number, this percentage, has to be below 39%. There's a little bit of wiggle room between different lenders. Some will give it a little bit higher than this and it's slightly below this, but as a rule of thumb, around 39%. Now, on the flip side, if we scroll over here, there's another very, very similar thing called total debt service ratio. It's basically the exact same thing, except the first number in the comparison is not only your housing costs, but it's your potential housing costs with this new mortgage, plus any of your other debt costs, your payment of a student loan, maybe your payment on a car loan, credit card debt, lines of credit. All of that is lumped together, your monthly payments you need to make on that versus your income. Same example, let's say that your rent or your mortgage payment as well as all these other debt costs were $600 and you made $1,000 a month, well then you'd have a 60% total debt service ratio. And in order to get a mortgage, you're going to need to keep that TDS below 44%. Again, give a little, take a little. Now, the real reason most Canadians can't get a mortgage is because this GDS and this TDS, well, they can't get those percentages to work. Just to hammer the point home, here's a quick example. Let's say you want to buy a home that's $875,000, which in many Canadian markets, unfortunately, isn't that unreasonable. You'd have to have a 20% down payment in many cases. That'd be $175,000. Now let's get into the calculation of the mortgage and your GDS and your TDS. It's really simple. I think this is going to make a lot of sense. That would be a $700,000 mortgage. Let's say you got it over 30 years at 5%. That would mean that you're paying $3,757.75 per month on that mortgage. Now remember, that mortgage needs to be at maximum 39% of your total income, which means that you would need an income of $9,635 a month to have $3,757 be only 39% of your total income, right? $3,757 is 39% of that $9,635 income number. Now that is a lot of money to make, and most Canadians can't make that work. But to make matters worse, in Canada, to get a mortgage, most of the time you need to go through a mortgage stress test, a system that makes sure that even if interest rates were to go up, you would still be able to afford it. So you wouldn't have to just qualify at 5% interest rate, you'd have to qualify at 7%, 2% higher than the rate that you get. So if we keep on going here, well, that same mortgage at 7% would be $4,657 a month, which means that you'd need to make $11,941 to have that percentage math out, right? Which would be around $143,000 a year, which just simply isn't feasible for many Canadians. So I don't get why this whole credit score and having your rent payments contribute to your credit score situation is an issue, right? It's clearly not an issue of having a good credit score, why Canadians can't buy a home. Credit scores aren't what's holding Canadians back from affording a home, as Trudeau in his new rental tracking initiative would like you to have, or would like you to believe. Now, the reality is that people can't qualify for mortgages because their income isn't high enough to hit the GDS and TDS targets, and because many people just aren't able to save up the hundreds of thousands of dollars of down payment needed to make that actually work. And I think Ron Butler puts it perfectly here when he says, hey, less than 8% of all applicants for a first-time mortgage are turned down based on credit score. 92%, the vast majority, are approved or rejected because they could or could not afford the payments. It's a very minimal amount of number of mortgages that are actually impacted by high or low credit scores. And in most cases, if you can afford and make that GDS and TDS work, then even if you have not the greatest credit score, you can go to a B lender like a credit union, or a C lender, a private lender, and get a mortgage still. So many times it's the payments that make the difference, not the credit scores. I just don't understand why this is such an emphasis. But regardless of the reality of the situation, Trudeau, probably about 6 different times in this press conference that I watched, theatrically kisses the ass of young Canadians who helped him get elected last time, now desperately trying to convince them that, hey, this program that I'm announcing, this is going to make a difference for you, so you should vote for me.
In a world where you pay more than ever for rent, what could be a better demonstration that you're a good investment? And what is a better investment than in you, young Canadians? You make up the largest share of our working age population. You work hard. You're creating, inventing, and developing incredible things that are building the future of Canada. You hustle. You are the heartbeat of the economy. And Canada's success in the 21st century depends on you.
Now, we're going to get into the nefarious way this landlord-renter tracking system could actually backfire on renters. But first, let's give the benefit of the doubt here. Many Canadians, through no fault of their own, may not know about the GDS and TDS stuff that we just talked about. Now, that's not their fault. I think it's a failure in the education system, but that's beside the point. Now, many people might think, yeah, okay, my credit score should go up because I pay my rent on time. So let's just say, even though you and I know that it's not true, that the only reason Canadians can't get a mortgage is because their credit score isn't high enough. Now, including future rent payments after the start of this program wouldn't be the way to solve this problem anyways. You see, the most important thing that goes into making up your credit score is your payment history, or like your payment history percentage, like the amount of times you've actually made your payment on time versus the amount of payments you've made in total. Let's say you have a credit card and you've had it for 10 months and you've made 9 out of 10 of those payments. Well, that would give you a 90% sort of rating here, right? Now, similarly, if you had like 2 credit cards and you had them for 10 months and made payments on both of them, but you missed one payment on one of those cards, you'd have 19 out of 20, giving you a 95% sort of a score when it comes to your payment history. This has the biggest impact on your credit score because it gives potential lenders a better idea of how regular you are in making your payments. Now, this example here of adding a second credit card, like I'm doing right here, is basically all that this inclusion of rent payments would do. It would be like adding another thing that's tracked for your payments, where instead maybe this number would look more like 29 out of 30, because now for these 10 months, we've also tracked your rent history moving forward from the date that this policy would be implemented. So this whole thing that the government is saying will make such an impact will likely only marginally impact your credit score, because there's no way for them to include all of your previous rent payments to sort of make this fraction look better. It'd almost be better or just the same to get another credit card and spend $10 on it each month and pay it off each month for a year. That would have the same effect as a year's worth of rent payments when it comes to your credit score, apart from a little bit of a positive impact from having better credit diversity, like different types of loans, different types of payments being included in that credit score. All that to say, even if credit scores were the problem, this solution wouldn't do much, and to implement this solution, we open up a whole new can of worms, one that I think could end up biting renters in the ass. You see, one of the biggest issues for landlords these days is the threat of getting a tenant that stops paying rent. In many of the more populated provinces, there's this huge backlog of up to a year for landlord or for tenants for that matter, for them to get a ruling from the decision makers who settle these landlord-tenant disputes. And this is an example of it. I think this has largely disincentivized mom and pop landlords, reducing rental housing stock. Some tenants, some bad tenants, will weaponize this wait time and stop paying rent and never have to deal with the consequences as they move on to the next rental unit before ever repaying their unpaid rent. All this to say that, at least in Ontario that I'm most familiar with, in this landlord-tenant situation, the tenants are the ones that really have a lot of control, at least when it comes to the landlord-tenant board and the waiting that they have to do. But on the flip side, if this policy were to be implemented, if tenant payment history were to be tracked, it would be really more of a benefit for the landlords if you think about it, because if a tenant doesn't pay rent, then there's more on the line because that non-payment of rent would impact their credit score negatively. Now, on top of that, if non-payment of rent impacts your credit score, well, then landlords are probably going to put more emphasis on checking a potential tenant's credit score before agreeing to rent out their property, knowing that if they had previously not paid rent in the past, well, they'd probably have a pretty shitty credit score. But let me show you this. This rental payment tracking system isn't the only measure that they're trying to bring in and that they've just announced over the past few days. Here's another clip.
If you're renting right now, you're going to want to hear this. Our upcoming budget is going to make renting fairer. That means making sure you can see what previous tenants of your apartment paid so you can negotiate a fair deal. It means making sure that your rent payments are counted by the bank towards your credit score. It doesn't make any sense for someone who pays $2,000 a month in mortgage payments to get credit for it, but not someone who's paying $2,000 in rent.
The second point there we've already talked about, but the first one, this one doesn't really make a lot of sense to me either. He's saying that each tenant should be able to see the history of what any unit has rented for in the past to give them the ability to negotiate a fair price. Now, I don't think it's a bad idea to sort of make rents public, right? But I just don't understand how this gives a tenant any leverage. Rents aren't set by someone's knowledge of what it's been rented for in the past. Instead, rents are set by the market and what people are willing to pay today, not by what people were willing to pay 3 years ago. Now, imagine this conversation, and while I have it, keep in mind the vacancy rate in much of Canada is hovering around 2 to 3%. There's not a whole lot of rental units out there. Imagine you're a tenant, and there's 10 different people applying to stay in the unit that you want to stay in, and you look at this new registry and you go check it out and say, the previous renter was paying $400, $500 less than what you're charging today, so I'm not going to rent this unit unless you give me that new price. That's the kind of negotiation that it seems like they're imagining will happen here. But in reality, the tenant's going to, or the landlord's going to get market rent. There's 10 other people that are looking to rent this place, and it's going to rent for however much it's going to rent for. And you knowing what it rented for in the past doesn't really give you that much leverage when it comes to negotiation. Or am I missing something here? I don't understand it. But there's something that's even more frustrating, and I hate to always be the bearer of frustrating news, but it seems to be what most of the news is these days. This brand new plan that they have, the one with the rental payment history tracking, how are they going to actually do it? How are they going to implement it? Well, it turns out that they don't even really know.
There are technical challenges to that. If you can imagine someone paying rent to an uncle or paying rent to an elderly landlady who lives upstairs, maybe the records keeping and the documentation isn't quite there in a way that would make this easy. So there is going to be an implementation period.
He makes a good point. How are landlords going to submit this information? And what even is their incentive to do so? If they see no benefit, it simply won't get done unless it's mandated in some way where the federal government forces individual landlords to submit more documents, or hey, maybe the government will build a fancy rent tracking app that costs hundreds of millions of dollars to produce, that largely gets paid out to middleman tech subcontractors. All in all, I think this is just another policy that isn't very well thought through, and it feels like it's just another thing that they can point to and say, look, hey, we're doing something. Hey, all you young voters, we're doing something. Look at us. We're solving these problems that you have. And as a result, I think a lot of people who don't understand how credit scores work, or why they can't qualify for a mortgage, will think, hey, that sounds good, even if it doesn't really actually make an impact on their situation. To me, time and time again, it seems like with this government, it's more about getting votes and trying to improve their polling and saying things that sound good to people who aren't able to take a closer look at what they're saying. It seems it's all about doing whatever they can that will sound the best without actually changing all that much, which I think is just unfortunate. But it's not just my opinion that counts. I'm curious what you think about all of this. I could be completely wrong and off base on this. Where have I gone wrong? Let me know down in the comments. I'd be happy to listen to any of your thoughts down there. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Check out the link in the description for the sponsor of today's video, as well as signing up for the email newsletter that goes out after every one of these videos with a summary, as well as all of the sources that I've used to make the video. But with all that said, thanks so much for watching. I really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.